My name is Haley Moss. I am from Miami, Florida. As you've heard, it is sunny and warm out today, as usual down here, it seems like. And I am autistic. I am an attorney, an author, and I am an advocate who's really, really passionate about neurodiversity, especially at work and inclusion. So it's really wonderful that we're talking about workplace today. We are in the middle of National Disability Employment Awareness Month. So this is a super timely and exciting topic for all of us. And our presentation today is also chock full of resources and so many great things that y'all should be looking into and investigating. And if you want to get in touch offline, here's my email, some social media, and please feel free to say hello at any point. And if you have questions, comments, concerns, anything we can help you with, feel free to stick them in the chat or the Q&A. And without further ado, let's get the show on the road today. So you may have been here before with me, or you might be new. Regardless of whether this is your first time with me as part of ADA, or this is your third time or multiple times, that's okay, because some of this might be new, some of this might not be. So we're going to go over a couple of things to help make sure everybody's on the same page, no matter where we are in our learning journeys. And to really get that conversation flowing, we're going to talk about what neurodiversity is, since most of us are pretty familiar, hopefully, with what autism is. And if you're not, autism is a neurodevelopmental disability that affects all sorts of areas of a person's life. So social, cognitive, like sensory, all sorts of different things. Every human on the spectrum is different. But when we're talking about neurodiversity more broadly, we're talking about how neurological differences are to be recognized and respected just like any other human variation. And you're going to see these words neurotypical and neurodivergent kind of a bit throughout today and throughout any time that I usually am speaking. And what that really goes to is that neurodivergence or neurodivergent means that your brain works outside of what's expected. And neurotypical means that your brain acts in an expected, quote unquote, normal, whatever that's supposed to mean, way. And when we're thinking about what neurodivergence is, it includes differences in communication and thinking. And a lot of people fall into this category. So it could be up to about 1 in 7, which does check out, because when you look at who has a disability today in the United States, it's about 1 in 4 Americans has some type of disability. We're going to talk a little bit about disability more broadly in the context of who has a disability, what that means a little bit later. But when we're talking about neurodivergence, we are being sure to be inclusive of autism, ADHD, learning disabilities, Tourette syndrome, intellectual disabilities, psychiatric disabilities, and acquired cognitive disabilities. When we're talking about autism and autistic people, keep in mind that some of our colleagues, ourselves, or our friends and loved ones could have multiple different forms of neurodivergence. So you might have someone who has autism and ADHD, autism and anxiety, autism and a co-occurring intellectual disability. And even throughout the lifespan, when we talk about acquired cognitive disabilities, we might be thinking about things like a traumatic brain injury or Alzheimer's or dementia as somebody gets older. So this is something that can affect you or your loved ones at any point in your life. And I think that's super fascinating to think about. But when we think about neurodiversity in the workplace, we have a very interesting story, is that it's something that we find is extremely beneficial. And chances are, no matter where you work, you're going to experience this, because we all work with different kinds of minds and we have different kinds of minds. And what seems to happen when we have neurodiversity in employment settings are all good things, that we have neurodiverse teams saving millions of dollars to companies by creating technical fixes, such as that German technology company, SAP. When we are hiring people with disabilities in the workplace, companies make more money, that they have higher shareholder return and revenues than companies that don't employ disabled people or people with disabilities. We have favorable public opinions of businesses. This is something I know that's especially true for me. So I live in a pretty metropolitan area. I live walking distance to 2 grocery stores. And one of those grocery stores is a known champion in my community for hiring people with disabilities that are often pretty visible. So we have a lot of folks with Down syndrome who might be autistic or have physical disabilities working there. And every time I go to the grocery store, there's a cashier with Down syndrome. And quite honestly, I feel pretty great supporting them, knowing this person's part of my community. He gives me a hug when it's safe to do so every time I see him because he's seen me for the last 6 years. Like, I feel good about supporting this business as compared to the other grocery store down the street. So this is kind of a human element of it, is we just feel good about supporting people who support our community. I know when I think about the grocery store, they're really good at paying folks fairly. They're really good at keeping these people in employment settings. And finally, we benefit from working with people who do think differently and have different approaches to problem solving or different approaches to how they go about their day and how they go about experiencing the world. But we have a different story when it comes to autism. Is despite all of these benefits, we have the lowest employment rate amongst all disabled people. And what happens with that is people are likely to be unemployed entirely, or they're underemployed. And when I say that we're underemployed, I mean that you have folks that are educated or highly qualified in some area, but their job doesn't necessarily match their expertise, ability, or education level. So you might have someone who might have a PhD who is working in a job that might only require a bachelor's, and they might be working in what is considered retail or hourly work or something else that isn't necessarily matching up to, say, that PhD in computer science, as the stereotype somehow goes. And when we think about employment, it gets harder for folks who are college graduates. This is something that happens across the board with disability. And even when we think about salary disparities in a broader disability context, is that the more highly educated someone is, the greater the salary disparity. There's a really interesting white paper on this from, I believe it was the Ruderman Family Foundation. And when we think about who is paid for their work, it's a pretty low percentage of people with intellectual and developmental disabilities that are paid employees. We see a lot of unpaid interns. We see a lot of people who might have arrangements under a sub-minimum wage in Section 14C of the Fair Labor Standards Act. So certain nonprofits and certain businesses that have certificates from the government are allowed to pay less than minimum wage. At the federal level, there's all sorts of really interesting stuff in the employment space. And young autistic adults are less likely to have work experience than their non-disabled neurotypical peers. So think about, when we talk about young people, what kind of work experience they have. Maybe as teenagers, they worked in retail, maybe they worked in food service, maybe they did some odd jobs, but most autistic people, and especially young adults, don't have this work experience. They might not have had their first work experience until college or even beyond that, depending on the person's ability, depending on how much they struggle with different tasks in their lives. So I even think about myself, I didn't have traditional work experience in a paid setting until law school. I did unpaid internships when I was in college. I didn't work while I was in high school. That my first paid work experience, I was 22 years old. And I realized that isn't necessarily something that we think of as very typical. And that really does hinder autistic people who might be looking for jobs or who are expected to have more life experience that matches with their chronological age necessarily. I guess that's kind of what I'm trying to get at here as well. And when we think about these disparities, so we have all these great benefits of neurodiversity. We have awesome autistic people who seem to be having a difficult time getting employment, despite the fact that when we hire people with disabilities, we have neurodiversity, we save money, we have great fixes, we have creativity, we have innovation, that people feel good about supporting these businesses. We have so many great things happening. But what seems to happen is that there's so much bias at play. We have traditional hiring practices that are biased against autistic candidates. And when I say traditional hiring practices, I mean stuff with like interviews, maybe it's even just how artificial intelligence might be in play. So I am really passionate about legal research and finding out more about disability bias under the law. And my last scholarly paper was actually about AI in particular and how it does have bias in hiring settings against disabled candidates. And when you see these things like remote video interviewing, that sometimes these machine systems are really looking at how much eye contact someone's making, the cadence of their voice, what words they're saying, all sorts of really strange things that we might not have thought twice about. And it does end up being unfavorable to autistic and neurodivergent people. We also have misinterpreting communication. And when we think about autistic communication, it could be that people might come across as overly enthusiastic, not enthusiastic enough. Their body language might be confusing. There's all sorts of different stuff that neurotypical people somehow don't get. And on the other side of that, sometimes autistic people don't understand neurotypical communication. It's a lot like having two separate languages being spoken at the same time, except the autistic person who is speaking that less dominant language is at a disadvantage. We also have things like our body language and our eye contact. So you might see someone who's stimming, who might be moving their hands more, they might be fidgeting because they're nervous, or you might also have things like eye contact. And when we think about eye contact in particular, this one is the one that always kind of grinds my gears, is I know interviewers and employers take this really seriously. They see it as a sign of focus, of trustworthiness, and all sorts of other good stuff that seems to make sense. However, for a lot of autistic people, myself included, eye contact can be really uncomfortable. And when I'm looking someone in the eye and I'm not just cheating and looking at their nose, it makes it very difficult for me to focus on what the person is saying. And I'm kind of compromising on my ability to be able to do things and listen, to have the illusion of looking like I'm listening. And most people don't quite understand that right away. Instead, they're so focused on how is this person appearing. We also have folks who have gaps in employment. So they might have gaps after college, or if they didn't go to college because they might be working with voc rehab or other employment services, job coaches, or maybe they got fired from their first job, they became self-employed. There's all sorts of different things that have gaps in employment. And a lot of HR managers and a lot of recruiters see gaps in employment as a bad thing without really knowing what's going on. Or sometimes a disability just makes it very difficult to work, and they may have not been employed for a certain amount of time due to their disability. We also have disclosure issues, which we're going to talk a lot about and unpack as much as we can. We have the very obvious kind of based on all of these different factors of discrimination on the basis of disability. And finally, from the hiring perspective and the management perspective, there's a huge fear of the unknown. A lot of us might not have ever worked with autistic people before in a professional setting. And I'm not just talking about the friends and colleagues who are working in autism intervention and services. I'm talking about regular office jobs or other lines of work where you might not have experienced working with autistic people before. And oftentimes there's this fear. And that's something that happened when I was looking for jobs and when I was in office settings and when I wasn't self-employed, is there was this, how are we going to manage this person? What accommodations are they going to need? This is a lot of stuff to think about. It's overwhelming. It's scary. Maybe we're going to get sued. Maybe there's an issue here with the Americans with Disabilities Act. What do we do? And when we think about that fear of the unknown, it really does end up keeping people out. It really is a form of gatekeeping because we just aren't educated on the issues, nor do we really want to be, it seems sometimes. Which brings us to this idea of disclosure. And we're going to unpack disclosure quite a bit. Is when we're thinking about when we're disclosing about autism, everyone likes to ask, when is the right time? Or is there a right time to disclose autism or neurodivergence? And the truth is, this looks different for every single person. Disability, neurodiversity, and autism are not a monolith. There is no one correct mathematical answer to this question. It's depending on the person, it might be advantageous to disclose, or it might never be advantageous to disclose. So some people might disclose very subtly in a cover letter or a resume. So the soft like resume disclosure, someone might mention that they, for instance, maybe volunteered with the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network, or that they were a campus leader in a self-advocacy like organization or something. That some folks might mention in their cover letter, especially if they're working in disability services or going to be a disabled or neurodivergent person working in the field of disability, they might mention it right away in a cover letter to say, look at why I'm enthusiastic about this position. Some people might wait until they have an offer in hand, so then they realize that their disability was not at play during the interview phase, and then start working on that accommodations process if they need something. Or there are folks who might never, ever say anything until they feel they have no choice. And that no choice moment is usually when you need an accommodation. There is that feeling that people have to disclose because it's the only way you're going to be able to get an accommodation, or if you're concerned about discrimination, it's the only way to prove or show that you have a disability. So there is a lot of things to consider. Some people might never disclose, and that's okay, and others might really feel compelled to disclose. Everybody's at a different place in this, and I want to reiterate again, that's okay. This is highly individualized, and disclosure is both a professional and a personal decision. Not everybody feels comfortable with it, depending on who they're talking to. So some folks might feel really good about telling their manager, but not HR. Some might feel great about telling HR, but not their manager. Some might only tell a colleague. Some might just never say a word. Everybody is different, and it is highly, highly situational. I know that for me, that how I disclose when I'm talking to friends is very different than how I disclose on a first date. It's very different than how I would disclose when I am talking to someone that I work with. So how we have these conversations and when we have these conversations is so individually tailored that we have to keep that in mind. And then we have to think about, how do we prepare young people for this conversation? Because having these conversations about disclosing disability is so awkward and uncomfortable. But something that I want to do, at least when we're talking about this, is I want to point you to some really wonderful resources that have better information, honestly, than I can. And I really enjoy and have worked through all of these, whether preparing presentations, getting ready to talk to all of you today, or even just thinking, how can we do this? And we can really promote this self-advocacy by discussing and providing resources. So attached and on the slide, there's a picture of it as well, is information from the Office of Disability Employment Policy from the Department of Labor. And ODEP has all sorts of wonderful information and resources. And this workbook on disability disclosure at work is something I think is super helpful and a great way to kind of work through this from a self-advocacy perspective. We are going to talk more about self-advocacy. I know we've done a prior webinar here all about self-advocacy, but if you didn't see that, or it's been a couple months and you're a little fuzzy on things, we're going to go over that too. Don't worry, everyone's at different stages in the learning. There's something to catch everybody up so you don't feel like, oh my gosh, I have to go back and rewatch a whole other hour and a half of stuff. Don't worry, I got you covered. So really keep in mind some of these resources, and some other things that I want to share with you as well are ideas about making disclosure decisions. So this is from Virginia Commonwealth University, and I thought this was super helpful to think about, and definitely look for this online as well, as this idea of disclosure decisions to get the job. And they really outline the different steps to disclosing a disability. So determining a need, deciding when is a good time, and how to have that conversation. So they might say what the good and the bad is of each time that you might disclose. So there's some good things about sharing in a cover letter. There's some setbacks, same with a resume or interviews before, during, and after. And if you want to never say anything. And again, the big thing with if you never say anything is that your information about your diagnosis is private, but you are not protected from discrimination under the ADA. That's a really big one to consider, that disclosing does protect you from discrimination under the law. So we could also decide how we want to disclose, and these are some really great how with examples, and I highly recommend checking this out when you have the chance. And this is some stuff that you might want to think about or work through with your young people, or if you're working as a job with a job coach or with vocational rehab. These are all sorts of things you want to be thinking about. And I hope that is a quick commercial basically for some really cool resources that I wanted to share. And again, I don't want to reinvent the wheel, especially when there's things that I realize are really great out there, and I don't want to take credit for either, because these are wonderful. And I'm really grateful that things like this do exist. Which also brings me to one of the best resources, whether you're an employer, you're a person with a disability, or you're supporting people with a disability, that you should know about. And this is called the Job Accommodation Network, or askjan.org. And Job Accommodation Network is funded by ODEP, so the Office of Disability Employment Policy in the Department of Labor. They have all sorts of really cool tips, solutions, things to think about. So if you're new to disability, if you're new to accommodations, there's tons of great information. There's information that they talk about specifically about autism with interviewing and disclosure. So if you really don't know what you're doing and you need a good place to start, please check out askjan.org. I highly recommend them. I've had the opportunity to work with and speak with their team many times at events, and I highly, highly recommend everything that they do. And I will be honest, I cite their information quite a bit anyway. So I'm giving you things straight from the horse's mouth here as well. But when it comes to things like interviews, there's so much to think about. The interviews is really where autistic people seem to kind of falter, or that we're nervous that they're not going to perform, or that someone's not going to see their value. And that's often because interviewers have very specific things that they're looking for and will judge job candidates on. And sometimes it's not something that's written in the job description. Sometimes it's not something that's super obvious. I once worked for somebody who allowed me to sit in on job interviews whenever they were bringing in new candidates. And I mostly went because I wanted to learn. I wanted to see what people were doing, what people's resumes looked like, what they were doing right and wrong. And my former boss looked at it as I was taking initiative in the future of the company and the firm. So it was kind of a win-win, but for me, it was a really good fact-finding mission. And what I learned is he liked to find out the person's personality more than anything else. Is that we already knew what we were looking at based on resume. And since most of these people were looking to be entry-level lawyers and things like that, we all knew that they had things like a bar admission, they had a Juris Doctor degree, they might have had various legal experiences as interns. If it wasn't their first job out of school, they might have had law practice experience. They might have worked in the same field of law that we did. But what really seemed to make or break those interviews was these ideas of personality questions. Is sometimes he would ask things about like, what's something that you're really proud of, or what's something that I wouldn't know about you from your resume. And in the end, one of the criteria that wasn't spoken was something like, would I want to be stuck in a layover at the airport with this person for 5 hours? And I thought that was a really interesting thought. And sometimes you might have heard this broken down as the, do I want to get a beer with somebody type thing, but that's not my style. So I was thinking of him saying, do you want to be stuck in an airport with them? And I'm thinking that's such an interesting thought, but how relevant is that? How often is it that I'm stuck in an airport for 5 hours with this person? Or would I be? And another friend who worked in HR told me these weird criteria that's being looked at is even when they were asked in an interview once to describe how they would make a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. And it was really just to evaluate the person's creativity, despite the fact that at the job, they would never have to make a PB&J sandwich. Totally strange stuff that interviewers might be looking for and judging. So sometimes we might not know what we're doing and we might not do well in those settings. So we might be misinterpreted as not trustworthy or distracting based on eye contact and fidgeting and other things. And those open-ended questions can be difficult to gauge. So telling you how I'd make a peanut butter and jelly sandwich is such a difficult open-ended question. It has nothing to do, chances are, with the practice of law or most other jobs that aren't in food service. And other open-ended questions can be really confusing. And you might have to walk your candidates and learn how to best answer these. So one of the most dreaded questions that shows up at almost any interview that I've been to, or my friends and colleagues and anyone else that I know has been to, is tell me about yourself. And tell me about yourself in an interview setting, in a professional setting, means something very different than tell me about yourself in literally any other format. And apparently tell me about yourself, as I have learned, does not mean share that I am 27, I am a Taylor Swift fan, I like to play games, I like to do this, and also I am a lawyer. Like, that's not what they're looking to hear. They don't want to hear about the fact that I'm secretly a huge nerd. They want to know about my professional experience, where I went to school, all sorts of other relevant things. So something that helps a lot is these skills-based interviews versus question-based, or having those questions ahead of time. So knowing how to prepare and knowing what to be thinking about can really help close that employment gap and set autistic people up for success. It's really frustrating to think about is how many different little traps almost there are throughout interviews that often are benefiting neurotypicals, or it's a game that we don't always know the rules to because the rules are always changing. And there are certain accommodation ideas that you can get during an interview on the basis of autism or disability. And some of these are the ideas from Jan and that you're able to do actually, which I never would have thought about some of these unless they were brought up or I knew that they were viable accommodation ideas. So you can request having fewer interviewers. So sometimes you might have an interview that's conducted by like 3 people at the same time, kind of that panel interview. And I know for a lot of folks that could be very anxiety inducing. That can be really scary, especially because you might be expecting to meet with one person and suddenly you're thrust in there with 3. You could definitely request to have fewer people present. You can also request a first interview be conducted over the phone or Zoom or whatever other technology might help make it easier or give you a moment to breathe. Maybe phone interviews are easier because you don't know where you're going. You might not have reliable transportation. You might struggle with something like reading the body language and nonverbal cues. Something that I really like that both Jan and also the Stanford Neurodiversity Project does is they'll request a copy of interview questions in advance. So then they're able to think through them, especially if they're relevant to the job, unless something like thinking on your feet is that essential to the job itself. They might not, that's the only way they usually might not provide this. And something that Stanford does as well is they recommend also having the candidate come up with a list of questions that they would ask the interviewer. So everybody switches their questions beforehand and there's no real surprises and everybody's on equal footing in that setting. You can also request that an interview occur at a specific time of day. So that might have to deal with reliable transportation, or maybe you're just not a morning person. I know I'm not a morning person, but there's so many different ways, and depending on disability as well, that you could request this as an accommodation. So these are a couple things that we could be thinking about if we do choose to disclose before the interview phase when we are given an interview. So there's all sorts of great tips for disclosure, but this is something that I think can be really helpful. If you're looking for accommodations, this might also be a great time to share or disclose to somebody in power to help make this happen. So when we're talking about disclosure, I am someone who is extremely open. And when you hear about me, you probably have heard me referred to as Florida's first openly autistic attorney. And folks often go, Haley, that's all great, but what does it mean to be openly autistic? And I think that's such a great question. And openly autistic goes to the fact that I am very open. You can't read my resume without knowing I'm autistic. You can't Google me without seeing autism. I am forced to disclose no matter what I do. And I did not realize the impact on my life that would probably have when I was 13 and I first got involved in autism advocacy. I don't regret it whatsoever. For me, it's definitely been a journey. I'm very aware of the fact that sometimes I face more prejudices and stigma than I would like. But being open for me means I don't feel like I have to hide or mask my autism. I don't feel like I have to pretend to be somebody else or hide things about me that are socially unacceptable, that I have the freedom to be exactly who I am. And as someone who now does a lot of corporate trainings and events, it's really interesting to see that focus of bringing your whole self to work and being authentic and all that, because that's often the messaging that they're looking for and expecting me to provide as well. And I'm thinking, but there's so much bias before you even get to that stage. How do we just like dismantle that? And that's where I end up going with those conversations. And I think it's so interesting to think about when we talk about being open, is making sure that we give people the freedom to do that. But sometimes you might not feel like you have the freedom to be open until after you're inside of an organization and got through the door in the first place. When we're talking about discrimination and we're talking about bias, you've heard me mention the Americans with Disabilities Act very briefly a couple of times. And the ADA is a huge civil rights law and piece of legislation that was passed in 1990. It was amended again in 2008. It's divided into 5 titles dealing with employment, public stuff, private stuff, government stuff, all sorts of really interesting things, telecommunications. So Title I of the ADA specifically is all about employment. And essentially what Title I does is it prohibits private employers, state and local governments, employment agencies, and labor unions from discriminating against qualified individuals with disabilities in job application proceedings, hiring, firing, advancement, compensation, training, and other terms, conditions, and privileges of employment. So basically that means it covers everywhere in the employment process from hiring to firing and recruitment. That's a lot of stuff. And the ADA covers employers with 15 or more employees, and again includes state and local governments. So any employer with 15 or more employees is covered under this law, State civil rights laws might be a little bit more restrictive. So you might need to check what is going on in Illinois if they are that same floor of 15 employees, or it might be fewer than 15, but it can't be more. So that's something you should definitely check into to see if there is something similar that's at the state level, let alone the federal level. Is kind of to help understand this, and here is more of a plain language understanding when we're talking about legal disclosure and accommodation. So the ADA essentially forbids employers from discriminating against applicants and employees on the basis of disability. And when we're talking about accommodations, the general rule, I know we were talking about when do we disclose, you might want to disclose early. The general rule for legal purposes is you don't have to disclose until an accommodation is needed. And what happens with accommodations is employers are required to provide reasonable accommodation to individuals with disabilities or that are employees or applicants, except when it would cause an undue hardship. And when we're talking about undue hardship, that is a legal fancy way of saying it is impossible or it's too expensive. So if you are someone who gets migraines or has sensory issues due to fluorescent lights, it is probably unreasonable to ask the office to replace every single fluorescent light in the building. I don't make the rules. I would love it if they replaced all the fluorescents. I think they're the worst. They hum, they give me headaches, and they're really, really bright. So they're bad. But I was never able to talk someone into replacing all of them. The most I was able to do was get something that might have been more reasonable, like you can wear noise canceling headphones, or you can maybe dim the lights or shut the lights off if you feel like it. So think about what is reasonable and what just seems absurd. And when we think about accessibility and accommodations, it's really important that we realize what we think is going on isn't always necessarily the case. So employers are usually pretty weary about accommodations because they think that they cause undue hardship. They think that they're really expensive. But that's not necessarily the case according to Jan and the Department of Labor. It's that most accommodations are in a one-time cost territory of $500 or less, and many don't cost anything. So when I was talking about noise and things like that, when I was in my last office job, so when I was at the law firm and all that good stuff, I was allowed to wear headphones because I was always distracted by my colleagues talking, by the printer, all sorts of other noises. So I was able to get an accommodation where I was allowed to wear headphones or AirPods or whatever I had at the time. Nothing too ridiculous, basically, because the caveat was I had to be able to hear the phone ring, because sometimes my boss would call to ask a question on a legal memo or a motion or something we were working on in litigation, and I couldn't just ignore it because I couldn't hear it. That wasn't acceptable. So as long as I had the volume on or they were not canceling all the noise, it was okay. And accommodations for people on the spectrum might look like headphones. They might look like having somewhere that's more sensory friendly, being able to move their bodies more. There's all sorts of different things that work for different people. What works for me might not work for you. Everybody's support needs are different. And I think that's really something we should be keeping in mind and thinking about during this conversation, is thinking about how everybody is different and how we could support the individual that we are or that we're working with in these settings. And then, of course, we have a subsection of people like myself who are self-employed. And a lot of people with autism and related disabilities are self-employed. A lot of us might not be able to succeed in that traditional interview setting. We might have entrepreneurs. We often have freelancers, so it might be artists or different services. We have gig workers. So I know a lot of people on the spectrum who are doing things like Uber or rideshare or delivering groceries or any of that types of food service, those types of gig work jobs. And we also have business owners like myself. So if you're wondering what I actually do for work, I do not practice law. I mostly do training and I do education on neurodiversity, autism, etc. I get to do really cool things like we're doing today. And also I do a lot of consulting, so for longer term things as well. And you have a very different way of going about things when you don't have a boss per se, even when you're working on a contract or something. And when we think about contracts, it's really important that we think about things like communicating with clients or whoever the contractor is as well. And we end up having to self-accommodate and be accountable. So there's nobody who can help accommodate the fact that I am terrible at executive functioning. I can't go to HR and ask them to schedule extra reminders. I can't ask my boss to be better at giving me instructions or things like that. So often I have to be accountable. It's up to me to sometimes spend time organizing my inbox so it doesn't feel like an executive functioning dumpster fire. I have to maybe make a list so I'm able to get everything done in a day or know what's urgent and important. There's also, or sometimes I even have to disclose to people that I work with, even though most people that hire me know full well that I'm autistic. But sometimes I have to really disclose extra and say, hey, if I don't get back to your email, please send me a follow-up. I'm not going to get offended. And if I send something late at night, it's probably not urgent. It's just that that's how my brain works best. Something else that we should be thinking about as well is there's all sorts of wonderful resources out there for autism and entrepreneurship and disability and entrepreneurship. So this is something to think about as well. If you're looking for those resources, please let me know. And kind of to get us started, some really wonderful ones that I appreciate are called Autism Career Pathways. They did a whole virtual course on entrepreneurship, and there's some really great resources as well from the Viscardi Center, which is all about disability and employment and entrepreneurship as well. And then of course there's things to be thinking about as well in that space. Like if you're a disability owned business enterprise, there's so many different resources and reasons why people do end up self-employed. And I know in the autistic community, this is definitely something to think about. So if you see people that are talking about doing something like driving for Uber or delivering food or whatever it might be, or starting a business or doing things like freelance art, like art or something like that, don't discourage it. Just know that there are different considerations to take into account when it comes to accommodations and also being accountable and taking charge. Something else we need to do when we are talking about workplace is we really need to focus on breaking stereotypes. And I am guilty of this too, especially when I was using examples earlier. And I was using those examples fully aware that we were going to be talking about stereotypes. As we talked about earlier, the person with the PhD in computer science. And that is often the stereotype of autism, that we're all these tech geniuses. And I went to law school. I am not a tech genius. And in my first job, I was automatically assumed to be a tech genius. And on top of my regular responsibilities, I was the lucky human being who was assigned to do things that were e-discovery tasks. So that's going through all these computerized documents, emails, and sorting them into spreadsheets and things like that. And also I ran the firm website for a brief time. I felt like there was a lot of pressure on me to be perfect, that I had to live up to the stereotype. But like many of us who went to law school, I went to law school because I am not a STEM genius and really great at science, technology, engineering, and math. That's kind of the joke amongst lawyers. I know, but some of us are really great at that. And if you are an autistic person who is awesome at those things, I have infinite amounts of respect for you, and I'm just a little bit jealous. There's also a huge stereotype about disability and disabled people that have to work in the field of disability. So I do work in this space because I genuinely love it. I want people to be better about neurodiversity. I want my profession to be better. But the stereotypes of this go into full effect based on the things that I receive. That I often get emails from people who are in very fraught situations that are demanding legal representation. And they assume right away that I am a special education or disability rights attorney. I never was either of those things. When I was in practice, I literally represented hospitals against insurance companies, or I was working in our international law practice, which basically dealt with matters relating to terrorism and helping victims of drug cartels and terror recover money that they were awarded in judgments. Not your typical IEP or ADA claim to be worrying about. That was not my forte. I love it from a policy perspective, not a litigation perspective. So it's still very awkward because I often have to say, hi, this is not something that I do. This is not something that I know what I'm doing, but here's a referral. And sometimes people get angry because I somehow failed to live up to a stereotype. Is stereotypes actually create more stigma? But if you are someone who fits into these boxes, that's wonderful. That I have infinite respect for you if you're doing work in special education, disability rights, or computers. It's just not for everyone, and that's okay too. So I want to talk a little bit about workplace shifts to self-advocacy. So we talked a little bit about disclosure. We talked about getting accommodations, but there's a huge self-advocacy component to it. And if you haven't been with us before and you haven't been with me, we did a session not too long ago about empowering the next generation of neurodiverse self-advocates. But if that feels like a distant memory or you weren't here from that, we're going to do a little recap on self-advocacy just so we have this in mind when we talk about workplace as well. So self-advocacy is both a set of skills and a movement. Is when we think about self-advocacy, it's really empowering people with disabilities to make choices that affect their daily lives and allow for greater independence. So this is something that we do every single day. Is we're making decisions, we're speaking up for ourselves, all this stuff. So as a personal and political philosophy, self-advocacy is a movement primarily of and by people with disabilities who are making their own decisions, speaking for themselves and for others, and taking control over their lives. So that's what we're doing. And when we think about employment, this is something that comes up quite a bit, is we are making decisions, we're speaking for ourselves, and we're trying to take control of our own lives and not have other people make those major decisions for us. And when we're thinking about those decisions and stuff, we're thinking, well, what if I'm not a self-advocate? What if I'm in voc rehab? What if I'm an employer? What if I'm a professional? What if I'm a teacher? What if I'm a caregiver or parent? What do I do? So fear not. There's a lot for you to be assisting with, and you could be a huge ally in self-advocacy. So you can be teaching these skills at home, at school, or if our young adults are in transition or receiving transition services, whether it's through the school system, whether it's through an independent nonprofit, whether it's through vocational rehab. There's so many different ways we can be able to build this skill set to help people stand up for themselves, make decisions, and take control over their lives. So in different settings, we're able to encourage self-advocacy. So employers and teachers and others really have a role to play in this as well. And there's so many simple ways to advocate for ourselves. You don't have to have some long drawn out speech to do it. Is that we could be saying things like, I don't feel comfortable with that, and respecting that boundary. Or when we're working with someone new, learning how they communicate and asking questions and letting them have the freedom to be able to say what they need. So maybe just saying, I need to take a break. And I think about this in school a lot, because this is probably one of the best versions of self-advocacy I've ever seen that applied to everyone. Is a few years ago, there was a hashtag that went around called I wish my teacher knew. And I think we could apply this to an employment setting if we really wanted to as well. And this was an elementary school teacher who on the first day handed out index cards and asked all of her students to complete the sentence, I wish my teacher knew. And the surprises that she got absolutely shocked her. She got stuff like, I wish my teacher knew that I take care of 3 siblings. I wish my teacher knew that I only have 1 pencil because my family can't afford school supplies. Or I wish my teacher knew that I absolutely am obsessed with Power Rangers. And all of these things inform the teacher about what her students needed. Like maybe the kid who mentioned the Power Rangers needed something like that in order to be engaged with learning. The one who didn't have enough pencils, maybe so she wouldn't chastise him for not having supplies, or the one who's taking care of 3 siblings might have other stuff going on at home and might not always be able to focus, or might need more support, or might need more leniency. That there's so many different things to be thinking about. And imagine if we advocated with that with our managers and supervisors and other things that we need. Like sometimes I wish that they knew when I got overwhelmed, I didn't know, I felt like I couldn't get anything done. That when I feel a certain way, I can't do this or that. So it's really important that we make it a safe place to advocate for ourselves and to help build that skill set. And sometimes it is completing these I statements that helps us advocate as best as we can. If we don't have the words to always say what we want to say, I need this, I want this, I feel X, Y, and Z. Those are all forms of self-advocacy that are pretty easy to fill in the blanks and be able to help start that conversation to get what we need, whether it's an accommodation or whether it's an informal accommodation, or we just want to have a conversation. But when we're having these conversations at work, we have some different decisions to make when it comes to disclosing and requesting accommodations. So accommodations should, at least in my opinion, be framed as a conversation that's empowering to both the self-advocate employee or candidate and the employer. So when you're already in the job, something I really like, and that's been recommended to me a lot as well, is filling in the blanks of I work best when. And this is really great for folks who are at a point in their self-advocacy journey where they might not have mentioned their specific disability or autism in particular, but they do need more assistance and don't feel comfortable going through the whole disclosure process. So something that I did, especially the first time I got asked to do a motion for a case that was being litigated in court, and I didn't know what to do because law school didn't prepare me for that, is my boss said, go write a motion. And I just sat there and I pretty much stared at the wall because I was told just do this thing that I never saw before. And I realized when I was getting into the thick of it, like motions are usually like 20 pages or so, because the one I was replying to was like 20 pages. And I was like, oh my God, this is so much. And I was so overwhelmed. And eventually I went to him and I said, I work best when you give me clear instructions. Can you help me break this down? And then we broke it down. So it's the statement of facts. It's the research on each of the points that the other side made and deciding who's wrong and why they're wrong under the law and all this different stuff. And having clear instructions made it clear to me when the deadline was, if this was more important than the other stuff that was on my desk, how I was going to approach it. And just saying, I work best when you'll give me clear instructions. That was enough to really open the door there. And when we have these different conversations, we have to decide who needs to know about autism. So I might have been a lot more open with my supervisor or managing partner than I was with the people who were on the same case as me as colleagues and other associates, because I didn't want to be seen as receiving special treatment. I didn't want to have them thinking that I wasn't going to be an enthusiastic member of the team. There were so many reasons that I was less likely to share with my equal colleagues rather than managers or HR. There are different pros and cons to disclosure in every situation. And that's something that kind of goes to why that I feel less comfortable disclosing to my coworker than I do my manager in most situations, or at least that's how I used to feel. I don't know if I'd feel the same way now in an office, but who knows now. And kind of deciding why there's an advantage. Do you want to be seen as proactive? Maybe they're going to see you as less capable. There's all sorts of things at play. We can really get into the academics of the why people might have these biases and about ableism, but we can save that for another time. And something else we can do when we have self-advocates and we are advocating for ourselves and others is we can advocate for accommodation solutions and workplace policies. So what I mean by this is I think about the very first internship that I held while I was in school. And when I was reading through the new employee handbook, there was something that was a fragrance-free policy. And I was thinking, oh my gosh, this means I can't wear deodorant. But really what that fragrance-free policy meant was no cologne and no perfume or nothing too strong. And I found out later on that that policy was there because somebody else with a disability advocated for it. And that policy existed so people with allergies and sensory issues wouldn't be overwhelmed or get sick in the office. And I thought that was so powerful that somebody really brought that to the attention of management and made that happen. Is that there are so many different ways to advocate for solutions and policy that somehow benefits all of us. And that was one of those examples that really stood out to me, is we might be able to have those solutions or advocate for those, not just for ourselves, but also for others. And when we think about neurodiversity at work, I want to pivot just a little bit into the future and what I hope we see more of and what we can work towards together. Is when we're thinking about the future of neurodiversity at work, I'm thinking about leadership, collaboration, and culture. I would love to see more neurodivergent and autistic people who are moving through the ranks. I'd love to see more collaboration with neurodiversity to make it an integral part of workplace culture, and also to help reimagine how recruiting and hiring and all that good stuff goes. And of course, I want to match people to their strengths so we don't run into those stereotype pressure problems or thinking that there's only a place for two different types of people, which is something that happens a lot. Is when you look at who is specifically targeting autism and neurodiversity in hiring, it often looks like retail and technology. I feel like there's often not a place for people like me. And there should be a place for everyone, because every single person who is on the spectrum has different talents, different hobbies, different strengths, different backgrounds, different educational interests, research, background, all that good stuff too. So when we're talking about neurodiverse leadership, I want it to be clear that autistic people want careers and not just jobs. So often employers think once this person is hired, they're done. They did everything that needs to happen. And that's not the case. We want something fulfilling long-term. We want to grow just like everybody else. And I think that's really important, is not seeing us as other, but seeing us as full human beings as well, which means the things that we struggle with once we're already there are things that a lot of folks struggle with and things that we might need some extra help with. So having opportunities to grow professionally and be mentored are so invaluable. So if you are an employer, I know that we saw some employers as stakeholders here today, that you're probably learning something new by being here, hopefully, and pass that on to your team. That's mentorship and growth, that or letting them know that there's a webinar occurring, but there's so many ways to encourage growth for employees and mentorship, that when you meet a new young person or we see a new autistic person at work, we can take them under our wing. I know, at least for me, I take it very seriously to mentor law students and young lawyers whenever I get the chance, because I struggled a lot with finding mentors that resonated with me and that I was able to be mentored by. It's something I honestly still struggle with, because I think a lot of folks thought, now that I'm here, I'm good, or they see me where I am now and they go, you're fine, you don't need this. And I think I do. I need opportunities to learn from folks who are more experienced than me as well. And when the time comes, especially because we're talking about career trajectories, that folks should eventually get to join leadership and executive teams and be able to have decision-making power. And imagine when folks like me get older, when we have us involved in hiring and interviewing, how much is that going to be revolutionized and redone when we realize that there are neurodivergent people in that role? Are they going to keep the same system that screens them out, or are they going to somehow make it so that everybody feels that they have an equal chance and access to getting the job of their dreams? I want to talk a little bit about the idea of having a culture of acceptance and inclusion and what that looks like. So I want to talk about vulnerability a little bit and being open. So we talked about being open today. And what's really important when we have this is it starts from the top down, that it should be a company-wide or employer-wide initiative, that openness should be for everyone. It shouldn't just be the autistic people, the young people having to share things that are hard for them, be open about their disability status. It should be for everybody, especially folks who are perceived as having power and authority. So that means managers, that means vice presidents, that means C-suite, that means whoever you are. And I really learned this because I teach an undergraduate class, and I love to talk about my college students. So please bear with me while I get really excited about them for a minute. Is when I started teaching in the psychology department at a university, I was very open with my students about my autism. I told them they could bother me with extra emails, especially if I don't respond. I let them know that I'm not trying to be difficult, that I want to help them as much as I can. And I'm very open with them. And I had one student at the beginning of my first semester of teaching come to me with an accommodation request from the university and all the paperwork from disability services. And I told her that's not a problem. And on the first day of class, in addition to helping her find a note taker on anonymously, I was disclosing to my students, and all of a sudden she shows up on the Zoom chat and she starts talking about herself. She starts talking about her disabilities very openly, not even mentioning the note taker that we assigned earlier in the day. And she's very open. And then all of a sudden, two other students are sharing, and neither of them came to me with accommodation requests or realized that they needed anything from the university, let alone me. But they were all sharing because I set the stage for them. They perceived me as someone who was older, who was more experienced, who had power and authority in that situation. And as an adjunct professor, I did have the power and authority of that situation because it was my classroom, my virtual classroom. So that was something that I think could go really well in the corporate setting. And I think when we talk about students versus young people versus employees, we have all these different conflicting thoughts. But my undergraduate students have honestly taught me enough about being open and vulnerable, realizing that when someone who is perceived as having power is sharing, it encourages and inspires other people to share. So please bring your full selves to work. Don't just expect it out of us. If you work somewhere larger, you might have employee resource or interest groups. And this is something that is super powerful. And if you're not familiar with this concept, it says this idea that marginalized groups have a certain employee-led initiative or place to meet or things like that. So some big companies have a disability group, they have a mental health group, they have a neurodiversity group. And it's a great place for folks to meet others like them, people who have family members. There's so many, and sometimes they put on external or internal events. It's really cool stuff. And if it's something that you're interested in doing, definitely get involved or talk to management about how to make that happen. So there's employee groups, I know, for women, for LGBTQ plus people, for people of color. There's all sorts of really interesting things going on in these major workplaces as part of diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives. And you can make sure that disability is part of that conversation as well. Again, we can match people to their strengths, which is so crucial. We can communicate openly about our needs, our wants, our goals, and our dreams. And of course, a lot of us probably go to corporate training a lot. It's something that I do professionally. I love it. Is having those trainings focus away from just training the autistic people to act neurotypical to being for everybody, so that we have autistic people who are being part of the conversation, and ideally they're leading it, because nothing about us without us is a thing. And also that we're able to share our experiences and ourselves and what we've learned from professional and personal experience, is that everybody should be learning how to work with people who are different than them, not just us. When we talk about focusing on strengths, I want to think about redefining some of the things that we see as difficult, right? Or that we think of as different. We think that this person's just obsessed with their special interest, or this person is maybe not focused on the right thing, or things like that. But some of the strengths of autism, especially, are things that we could see being really great in the workplace, or we might see them as rude or very blunt, but that might be integrity, that they're honest and loyal and committed. And they might have a lot of deep knowledge on a subject, or they might have really great concentration and thoroughness and accuracy. So really thinking about those strengths, especially when we're helping our young people write a resume, or we're talking to employers about partnering with us, or we're thinking about what is this person bringing to a job, is we need to think about these strengths. And it also helps us succeed. We can build self-esteem, we can advocate for ourselves better, and also convince employers that they're doing the right thing by being inclusive. And something that I want to bring up kind of as a final reflection for all of us is thinking about how we can do better no matter what profession we're in, to make sure that there's recruitment, hiring, acceptance, and support in the workplace. And I also want to make sure that we're talking about this being normalized as having success, that stories like mine of being an attorney, being employed, then being self-employed, like all of that stuff, not being seen as exceptional. I don't think my story is exceptional. I think my story just goes to show that there's so many different barriers in the way, and some of us are able to knock them down better than others, or have fewer barriers in their way. And of course, we should be making sure to encourage self-advocacy and teach those skills to people on the spectrum and all people with disabilities. So this is kind of where my head is at, and kind of unpacking a little bit of that neurodiversity and autism at work component. I'm really excited to hear your thoughts, your questions, and keep this discussion going. October is National Disability Employment Awareness Month. So if it's something that you haven't been thinking about, now again is the absolute best time and perfect time to have these discussions, to reflect internally and externally, and engage with disabled people and neurodivergent people to help have a more inclusive, equitable, and accessible workplace. Thank you. And I'm happy to answer any questions, any thoughts, anything that's going on with our attendees today as well.
Great. Thank you so much, Haley. If there's anyone who has any questions for Haley, I'm more than happy to unmute you, and you can ask verbally or you can post those in the chat. We'll kind of give everyone a second to think of any of those questions. I also am going to put our website in the chat for everyone. And if you would like to access any of our past recordings or Haley's past sessions, you can feel free to do so there under monthly webinars. And that's also where this recording from today will be housed, as well as her slide deck. So you'll have access to everything from today's session. I don't see any questions coming through in the chat, Haley. Oh, here we go. What advice do you have for young adults who are planning to attend college? When should they disclose?
For attending college, oh my gosh, that's a great question. And I think that, again, when you should disclose is a highly personal decision. I think that it's unique to everybody. I'm thinking if you feel comfortable disclosing on a resume, a personal statement, or if there's something like, I know when I applied to law school, you were allowed to attach a diversity statement, and sometimes that would be the place. I think it really does depend on the student. And of course, if they don't want to disclose at that point, they might choose to register with disability services. So then it's on standby if they need anything. I think that that's what I did, at least, is I might not have spoken to all my professors, but I was very honest and registered with disability services just in case. So I think this is important to everybody. And again, highly individual. Think about what your students' needs are, how comfortable they feel about disclosure, and take it from there. And that's something
Great,
you,
thank
especially
you.
because if they're probably planning to attend college, they're probably also not adults yet. So depending on how independent they are as well, that might be a decision they want to make with their family as or caregivers or other trusted adults.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Haley. What was the website you mentioned for entrepreneurs?
I mentioned Autism Career Pathways, which I believe is autismcareerpathways.org, and the Viscardi Center. I can link both of those in the for disability entrepreneurship. I can link both of those for you as well. And I'll stick those both in the chat for you. And there you go.
Great, thank you, Haley. Sabrina says she's working with several high school students on developing their own businesses, and that would be a great resource for them. So thank you for providing that. What advice do you have for businesses who are considering hiring a person on the spectrum?
To check your biases at the door and be open-minded, ideally. And also for businesses, I think you need to understand that, yes, there are obligations and needs, but also you're dealing with people, and autistic people are humans, and to please see us as full humans. And I don't want to say give us a chance, because I don't think when you're really just giving a chance at a charity, I don't want that to be the message or the takeaway. I want you to see the potential. I want you to realize this is probably good for your business. I want you to realize that you are hiring or considering hiring talented, hardworking, loyal, and creative people. And everyone just has different means of how they get there and who they are.
Great, thank you so much, Haley. All right, so I wanted to take this opportunity as we're closing out. Please feel free to type any other questions in the chat. But I wanted to take this opportunity to just remind everyone that tomorrow you will be receiving a follow-up email with a follow-up survey. If you have 5 minutes out of your workday to please provide us with any feedback regarding this session or any topics that you would like to hear about in the future, we would greatly appreciate it. Our professional development team would greatly appreciate it. And it'll also have the link in that follow-up email to our website where you can access the recording and presentation slides from today. And I don't see any other questions coming through. So Haley, do you have any final remarks before we close out this morning?
I think we are in good shape, and thank you all. And I'm looking forward to keeping the conversation going.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Haley. A quick plug before I do close this out. Haley will be back with us for our monthly webinar in December. And so make sure you are paying attention to our email marketing that is going out, and you can register if you'd like to hear from Haley again. She'll be presenting again for us in December. And so we're excited to welcome her back in December again. So we will see you all for our November monthly webinar. Marketing will be going out for that very soon. And then we'll be back with Haley again in December. I'm going to go ahead and close this out. Thank you so much, everyone, and have a great rest of your Tuesday.
Thank you for joining us.